On May 14th, an American president lands in Beijing for the first time in nearly a decade. The flags will be immaculate. The red carpet will be precisely measured. Security details from both governments will have spent weeks negotiating the exact placement of every vehicle, every podium, every camera angle, and in the Great Hall of the People, two men who together govern the lives of nearly 2 billion people and preside over economies that account for roughly 40% of global output will sit across from each other and attempt to manage something that neither of them fully controls, the most consequential rivalry in the world. And for the rest of the planet, watching from a distance, the question is not what they will agree to. The question is whether agreement even matters anymore. To understand what is happening in Beijing on May 14th, you have to understand how the two countries arrived at this room. Because the road from the last American presidential visit to this one is not simply a story of diplomatic distance, it is a story of systematic rupture. A trade war that cost both economies hundreds of billions of dollars, a pandemic that each side blamed on the other in ways that left scars in public opinion that have not healed. A Chinese spy balloon that drifted across American airspace and was shot down over the Atlantic, becoming for weeks the most visible symbol of a relationship that had lost its basic operating norms. A near crisis over Taiwan that brought both militaries to a level of alert not seen since the 1990s. And then, just weeks before the summit was originally planned, a war against Iran that consumed American strategic attention, depleted missile inventories, drove oil to $120 a barrel, and forced the visit to be postponed as Washington tried to manage a conflict it had not fully anticipated. That postponement matters more than the headline suggests. It was not a bureaucratic delay, it was a signal. China, in the weeks since the war began, has called for an end to hostilities while analysts noted the conflict could benefit Beijing by straining U.S. military resources and decreasing American capacity in Asia. Every week that the Iran war continued was a week in which China did not need to fire a single shot to advance its strategic position. Beijing watched, it calculated, and it arrived at the summit table having done precisely what the most sophisticated geopolitical actors do when the primary adversary is distracted. It strengthened its hand without showing it. In the weeks before the summit, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi conducted a 2-day visit to North Korea, his first trip to Pyongyang in more than 6 years, emphasizing high-level exchanges and expanding practical cooperation, forming part of a broader pattern of parallel diplomatic initiatives across security, economic, and diplomatic domains designed to preserve flexibility while strengthening China's negotiating position. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov visited Beijing, reportedly discussing energy cooperation and Moscow's willingness to fill the resource gap created by Middle Eastern instability. And throughout it all, China maintained its grip on the rare earth supply chains that the Iran war had made suddenly, viscerally visible to every defense ministry in the Western world. Rare earths are not, in most people's mental map, a subject for geopolitical drama. They are obscure elements with names that sound like they belong in a chemistry textbook. Gallium, germanium, neodymium. They are soft and silvery and largely invisible in everyday life, but they are also the materials without which modern semiconductors cannot be built, without which the guidance systems in precision munitions cannot function, without which the electric motors in military vehicles cannot operate, and China controls the processing of the overwhelming majority of global supply. Beijing's tight grip on rare earth exports has revealed the depth of U.S. industrial vulnerability in a globalized economy, one of Xi's core insights since Trump launched his campaign of punitive tariffs and export controls. The Iran war simply underlined it in red. Every precision munition fired at Iranian nuclear facilities was, in a sense, a data point in China's strategic calculation about what American military power actually depends on. At the Busan meeting in October 2025, China agreed to facilitate U.S. access to critical minerals and rare earth elements, while the United States suspended implementation of rules that would have expanded restrictions on Chinese firms accessing advanced technologies, steps that eased near-term tensions, but also signaled that national security measures had become negotiable in a commercial context. That exchange previewed the architecture of what May 14th is building toward. Not a grand bargain, not a transformation of the relationship, something more precise and more durable, because it is built not on goodwill but on mutual leverage. Both sides know exactly what they have. Both sides know exactly what the other needs. The summit is, at its core, a negotiation between two powers who have spent years studying each other's vulnerabilities and are now, for a specific window of time, willing to trade access to those vulnerabilities rather than exploit them. But here is what almost nobody is paying attention to in the diplomatic commentary about this summit. The agenda that will be visible trade volumes, tariff rates, agricultural purchases, investment frameworks is not the agenda that will determine the century. The visible agenda is the negotiation that both sides are comfortable discussing in press conferences. The invisible agenda is the one that will define whether the next decade looks like managed competition or unmanaged catastrophe. And the invisible agenda has one item at the center that neither government will formally acknowledge is on the table. But that shapes every other conversation in the room. Taiwan. In December 2025, 2 months after the Busan meeting, Trump announced a historic arms sale package worth $11.1 billion to Taiwan, which alarmed and infuriated Beijing, and the Taiwan question now stands as China's priority item for the May summit, with Beijing expected to press Washington for serious self-constraint on future arms sales and explicit opposition to Taiwanese independence. For Xi, this is not a negotiating position. It is an existential matter around which the entire logic of Chinese Communist Party legitimacy has been organized for decades. Taiwan is the unfinished business of the Chinese Civil War. It is the one territorial question on which no Chinese leader can afford to be seen making concessions. And it is the one question on which the United States, for reasons that are simultaneously strategic, legal, commercial, and deeply political, cannot simply give Beijing what it wants. Beijing will nudge Washington to loosen technology controls in areas such as semiconductors and artificial intelligence, remove sanctions against over 1,000 Chinese firms, and reduce restrictions on Chinese direct investment in the United States. These are the commercial demands. They are real and they are significant. But they are also, in the deeper strategic logic of this meeting, the currency being used to buy something else. Every concession Beijing extracts on semiconductors is a concession that weakens the American technological edge that underwrites the credibility of U.S. deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. China is not simply seeking market access. It is seeking, through the mechanism of commercial negotiation, to gradually erode the material foundation of American strategic commitments it cannot directly confront. And that's when everything shifted in the analysis of this summit. Because the most important precedent for understanding what happens in Beijing on May 14th is not any previous US-China summit. It is the summit that happened first. Trump in Beijing in 2017. He was received with extraordinary ceremony in the Forbidden City, accorded what was described as state plus treatment, given every diplomatic signal that the relationship was on a new and better footing. And then, within months of returning to Washington, he launched the trade war that sent bilateral relations to their lowest point in decades. Beijing will be watching closely for the policy flip-flops that undermined the relationship during Trump's first term. The Chinese system has a long institutional memory. It does not forget. And it has spent the years since 2017 building precisely the kind of leverage in rare earths, in semiconductor supply chains, in the processing capacity for the materials that American weapons systems depend on that makes a repeat of 2017 structurally more expensive for Washington than it was then. China is using an extraordinary lineup of pre-scheduled 2026 meetings to box Trump in and force a degree of, if not predictability, at least planability, in U.S.-China relations with Trump's planned visit to Beijing, giving China the opportunity to script the next interaction and press for a new wave of U.S. concessions over the coming months to lay groundwork for a favorable meeting, a dynamic that will play out again when Xi visits the United States later this year. This is not improvisation. This is the product of a state that thinks strategically across timelines that extend far beyond the next election cycle. Beijing does not need to win in May. It needs to lock in a process that limits American freedom of action through 2027. The summit is not the destination. It is the mechanism. What happens next is genuinely uncertain in ways that analyses of this kind usually understate. There are several plausible trajectories from Beijing, and they diverge sharply. In the first, the summit produces a framework agreement on trade and critical minerals that both sides claim as a victory, stabilizes the relationship for 18 months, and creates the space for Xi's Washington visit later this year to build on that foundation. Neither side gets everything at once. Taiwan is discussed privately, and neither side publicly acknowledges what was said. The relationship remains competitive, but returns to a level of managed friction that allows the global economy to breathe. In the second trajectory, the summit produces announcements that look more substantial than they are: agricultural purchase commitments, gestures on rare earths, language about cooperation on fentanyl, while the deeper structural tensions over Taiwan, semiconductors, and military posture remain entirely unresolved. The markets rally. The analysts write cautiously optimistic assessments. And within 6 months, a new provocation, a Chinese military exercise around Taiwan, an American arms sale, a clash in the South China Sea reminds everyone that the underlying rivalry did not pause for the photo opportunity. In the third trajectory, something goes wrong in the room or in the weeks that follow. Trump, who has a documented history of making commitments that his own administration later walks back, says something about Taiwan that causes a crisis of credibility with U.S. allies in Tokyo and Seoul. Or Beijing, emboldened by what it reads as American distraction and military overextension, accelerates its timeline for pressure on Taiwan in ways that test the limits of the ceasefire that brought Trump to Beijing in the first place. The broader context is one that almost nobody in the diplomatic commentary adequately captures. The United States and China are not simply two competing powers in the conventional sense. The competition between the United States and China differs fundamentally from earlier great power confrontations unlike the Cold War. When the US and Soviet Union operated largely separate economic systems, China and the United States remain deeply interconnected, with the two economies together accounting for roughly 40% of global economic output and global supply chains continuing to link American technology, Chinese manufacturing capacity, and markets around the world. They are rivals who need each other, adversaries who are structurally dependent on each other's continued economic function, competitors who share a planet, a climate, a financial system, and increasingly an artificial intelligence arms race whose outcome will shape the distribution of power for the rest of the century. The summit in Beijing is not a peace conference. It is not a declaration of a new era. It is something more mundane and more important than either of those things. It is an attempt by two governments that have very different systems, very different values, and very different interests to establish enough predictability in their relationship that the world does not accidentally end up in a war that neither of them wants, but neither of them has figured out how to reliably prevent. That is not a romantic story, but it is the actual story of how great powers manage their competition in the real world, as opposed to the theoretical world where values and institutions and good intentions determine outcomes. History has a way of making these moments look either more pivotal or less significant than they felt at the time. The Nixon visit to China in 1972 looked like a geopolitical masterstroke and was, in many ways, exactly that. But it also produced consequences, including the rise of Chinese manufacturing power that eventually displaced millions of American workers that no one fully anticipated. Every summit between these two countries has produced outcomes that the participants did not entirely control and that the subsequent decade judged differently than the immediate aftermath. May 14th will not be different in that regard. What is different is the context. The Iran war is still not over. The global economy is operating under a level of strain not seen since 2008. The nuclear non-proliferation framework is under more pressure than at any point since the Cold War ended. India and Pakistan have exchanged fire across a contested border while the world looked elsewhere. And two men, landing in Beijing with motorcades and press pools and the weight of the largest bilateral relationship in human history, will sit down in a room and attempt to negotiate the terms on which that relationship continues into the second half of the 21st century. What these meetings can do, when handled well, is make a potentially dangerous rivalry less volatile. That matters more than ever now, with the war in Iran driving a global energy shock and adding fresh instability to an already fracturing international order. The red carpet will be the right length. The stairs will be positioned correctly. The flags will not move. And in the room where it happens, the question that will determine more than any trade agreement or joint communique will remain, as it always has, unanswered. Not what these two countries will agree to, but whether they are capable of agreeing to enough, for long enough, to navigate a world that is changing faster than either of them fully understands.